Today's the day. Today, we install the lift kit. Welcome to Level Up Mechanics. My name is Chris, and in today's video, we're going to be installing the Eibach Stage 2 Pro-Truck Lift Kit on my 3rd Gen Toyota Tacoma. If you have any questions, make sure to leave them in the comment section below. Don't forget to subscribe, as 2021 will hopefully be the year of 1,000 subscribers. And with that being said, let's jump into the install. So to start the process, I'm going to put the rear lift blocks on first. But before we begin, I just want to go over some of the tools that I'm going to use today. Most of these items can be found on Amazon, so if you're interested in any of these tools, I'll provide a link in the description below. But first off, we have this Sunex 3/8 socket set, and then we also have a 3/8 torque wrench that I purchased from Home Depot. We have a very long, expensive snap-on 1/2-inch ratchet, and then we also have the Makita and some impact driver socket adapters. We also have some trim tool. This comes in a larger set that you can purchase on Amazon. We also have an assortment of ratchets, 1/4 inch, 3/8, 1/2 inch. I purchased these from Harbor Freight, and then we're going to be using some ratcheting wrenches. This set I also purchased from Amazon. We have some zip ties for the boots, the dust boots on the rear shocks, and then obviously pocket screwdriver. You never know when you're going to need it. And then we also have a 3/8 extension set. Oh, and the pry bar. One size and a really big size pry bar, both of which I purchased from Harbor Freight as well. So now that we have all of our tools and parts laid out to install, I'm going to actually start with the rear of the Tacoma. I'm going to go ahead and loosen the lug nuts, lift the vehicle, secure it on some jack stands, and then remove the wheels so we can move on to the next step. Alright, now that we have the vehicle properly secured onto some jack stands, the next step, we're going to be doing one side at a time. The first thing we need to do is support one side of the axle, because we'll be removing the U-bolts and bracket that connect the leaf spring to the rear axle. So use a hydraulic jack and support the weight of the rear axle on one side. See how it moved just a little bit right there? That way we know we are on the hydraulic jack and we are good to go. Now that the rear axle is supported by the hydraulic jack, we're going to remove these 4 nuts that hold the U-bolts onto the rear leaf spring. So we'll go ahead and remove these 4. One pro tip would be to use a cordless drill or a drill of some sort with a wire wheel attachment, just to clean the threads off of these U-bolts if they're really dirty. That way you don't seize the nuts when trying to remove them. Now that the U-bolts and the rear axle bracket are removed, the next step will be to disconnect the rear shock from the rear axle. We're going to use a 17mm socket and a 17mm ratcheting wrench in order to remove the lower bolt so we can disconnect the rear shock from the rear axle. Now that the rear shock is disconnected from the rear axle, we're going to drop the rear axle on this one side just a little over an inch by lowering the hydraulic jack. Be very careful if you do this to not lower it too much, because we still have all of our brake lines and wiring harnesses attached on the rear axle, so there's only a little bit of play that we want to do, just enough in order to slide the lift block into place. And now we'll raise the axle back up and make sure it aligns with the dowel on the bottom of the rear leaf spring. Next, we will slide the U-bolts into place. Now that the U-bolts are in place, we'll reattach the bracket. We'll add some washers and nuts onto the bottom. When we're tightening this down, we're going to go in a crisscross pattern, and we're also going to make sure that there's an equal number of threads showing on each of the 4 rods that attaches to the bracket. And then when we're ready and we're ready to torque it down, we'll torque these nuts down to 100 foot-pounds of torque, making sure that we torque down in a crisscross pattern and that each rod has an equal number of threads showing. The next step will be to remove the top of the shock from the frame of the Tacoma. In order to do this, you're going to need a 14mm wrench or a ratcheting wrench, and you'll also need a crescent wrench to hold the shaft in place while you're removing the top nut. Since the threads on the top of the shock shaft are pretty rusty, I'm going to go ahead and hit it with a wire wheel brush real quick and then remove the nut so I can remove the shock from the vehicle. You may also want to put a little bit of WD-40 on the threads just to make sure that they don't seize up. After tightening the top of the shock with a 17mm ratcheting wrench and a crescent wrench, now it's time to secure the bottom of the shock back onto the rear axle. If you see right here, it's a little higher than where the hole lines up for the bolt to go through. You can either try to extend the shock manually by pulling it out with your hand, or you can use your hydraulic jack and raise the axle in order to line up the hole to stick the crossbolt through. That's about all we have to do on this side. We'll repeat the process for the other side, after which we'll be able to put our wheels back on, remove the jack stands, lower the truck, and tighten the lug nuts down to 83 foot-pounds of torque. Alright, now that the rear suspension is complete, I've went ahead and jacked up the front of the vehicle, secured it on jack stands, and removed both of the wheels. So the first step is going to be actually to install these sway bar relocation brackets. These brackets are going to be installed where the sway bar is bolted up to. So right here is your sway bar. So what we're going to do is unbolt the sway bar at the front bushings and let the sway bar lie downward while we install the bracket. In order to do this, you're going to have to unbolt both sides of the sway bar bushing brackets at the same time, so that way the whole sway bar will lie down so we can install the relocation bracket. Now that the sway bar is disconnected from the frame, now we're going to install the bracket onto the frame. In order to install the bracket onto the frame, it's going to sit facing forward like this, or the sunken holes. We will use the original bolts that we took off to remove the sway bar, and we will install the original OE bolts into this indented portion at the factory threads and install the bracket onto the frame. I'm going to go ahead and actually remove the sway bar end link from the steering knuckle as well on both sides. That way I can set the sway bar out of the way for the entire process while we replace the front coilover shocks as well. Removing this completely and just rotating it out of the way will give me a lot of clearance when it comes time to replace the coilover shocks. So the next step, now that I have my sway bar completely disconnected from both the body and the suspension on each side, the next step is to disconnect the outer tie rod from the steering knuckle. So in order to do this, you're going to have a cotter pin right here that you're going to need to remove. Then you'll remove this castle nut, and then you'll use a hammer of some sort to hit the knuckle right here in order to dislodge the ball joint from the knuckle. So let me go ahead and get that removed now, and then we'll move on to the next step. Now that I've got the outer tie rod out of the way, we can now start working on removing the blue coilover shock assembly and make way for the new Eibach coilover shocks. So the first step will be to remove the cross bolt and nut for the bottom of the shock assembly. So we're going to go ahead and remove that, and then we'll work on the top of the shock assembly after. So the next step is to remove the 3 upper nuts on top of the shock mount. You're going to have one right here, and one on the back side. Once we remove those 3 nuts, we'll be able to move on to the next step in order to remove the coilover shock from the Tacoma. So now that we've removed the 3 nuts on top of the strut mount, it is time to try to snake out the coilover shock assembly. In order to do that, I'm going to use a really big pry bar to pry down on the lower control arm and see if I can get enough clearance in order to remove the coilover shock. Alright, now that we've removed the coilover shock, now it's time to install the Eibach coilover shock assemblies. Alright, so it looks like my light just went out and it has to recharge. I'm going to do the best that I can. We've got the coilover shock installed now. I've got the 3 bolts on top threaded and ready to tighten down. So I'm going to go ahead and tighten down the 3 top bolts, put in the bottom bolt, the cross bolt, and tighten that down. And then I'm just going to go ahead and replace the coilover shock on the other side. And then we'll come back and start putting everything back together. Now that the coilover shocks are installed on both sides, we can now start reassembling everything to put the wheels back on at the end. So we're going to need to tighten up the outer tie rod, the stabilizer end link, and then in addition to that, the last step is going to be to secure the front sway bar back onto the frame. You're going to use the new bolts that came with the sway bar relocation kit. They're going to be shiny as opposed to your OEM ones that you've already used to install the bracket. You're going to use your new bolts to bolt the stabilizer bar up onto the new bracket that you have installed already. Once that's done, all we have left to do is to put the wheels back on, torque them down to spec, and we're gonna see what this lift looks like. So let me go ahead and get this all tightened down, and I'll see you guys in the morning. So in the end, I was able to take my Tacoma to get an alignment. The alignment went great. I was able to dial in to factory specifications without a problem whatsoever. I gained a 2.5-inch lift in the front, a 1-inch lift in the rear, and the Eibach suspension performs wonderfully. Eibach is definitely an excellent choice when looking to upgrade your suspension, so if you're interested, make sure to check them out and see what they have to offer. I know they have more stuff coming out for the Tacoma in the future, most likely later this summer with the rear shocks. Again, if you have any questions about this video, please make sure to leave them in the comment section below and I'll get to them as soon as I can. Don't forget to subscribe, as 2021 will hopefully be the year of 1,000 subscribers, and I can only get there with your support. So please do me a favor, smash that subscribe button, like the video if you thought it was useful, and in the meantime, I'll see you guys in the next video. Later.